All right, so here we are, the Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, abridged edition, chapter 4. I was now landed and safe on shore, and began to look up and thank God that my life was saved in a case wherein there was some minutes before scarce any room to hope. I walked about on the shore, wrapped up in the contemplation of my deliverance, making 1,000 gestures and motions which I cannot describe, reflecting upon all my comrades that were drowned, and that there should not be one soul saved but myself, for as for them, I never saw them afterwards, or any sign of them, except 3 of their hats, 1 cap, and 2 shoes that were not fellows. I cast my eyes to the stranded vessel, when the breaking and froth of the sea being so big, I could hardly see it. It lay so far off, and considered, Lord, how was it possible I could get on shore? So he's looking at the stranded vessel, which means the boat, the ship that he was on, that is off in a distance, and he's wondering, how is it even possible that he made it to shore? After I had solaced my mind with the comfortable part of my condition, I began to look round me to see what kind of place I was in, and what was next to be done. And I soon found my comforts abate, and that, in a word, I had a dreadful deliverance, for I was wet, had no clothes to change into, nor anything either to eat or to drink to comfort me. Neither did I see any prospect before me but that of perishing with hunger, or being devoured by wild beasts. That which was particularly afflicting to me was that I had no weapon either to hunt and kill any creature for my sustenance, or to defend myself against any other creature that might desire to kill me for theirs. In a word, I had nothing about me but a knife, a tobacco pipe, and a little tobacco in a box. This was all my provision, and this threw me into such terrible agonies of mind that for a while I ran about like a madman. Night coming upon me, I began with a heavy heart to consider what would be my lot if there were ravenous beasts in that country, seeing at night they always came abroad for their prey. All the remedy that offered to my thoughts at that time was to get up into a thick bushy tree like a fir, but thorny, which grew near me, and where I resolved to sit all night and consider the next day what death I should die, for as yet I saw no prospect of life. I walked about a furlong from the shore to see if I could find any fresh water to drink, which I did to my great joy, and having drank and put a little tobacco in my mouth to prevent hunger, I went to the tree, and getting up into it, endeavored to place myself so that if I should sleep, I might not fall. And having cut me a short stick like a truncheon for my defense, I took up my lodging, and having been excessively fatigued, I fell asleep. When I waked, it was broad day, and the weather clear, and the storm abated, so that the sea did not rage and swell as before. But that which surprised me most was that the ship was lifted off in the night from the sand where she lay by the swelling of the tide, and was driven up almost as far as the rock which I first mentioned, where I had been so bruised by being dashed against it, this being within about a mile from the shore where I was, and the ship seeming to stand upright still. I wished myself on board, that at least I might have some necessary things to my use. When I came down from my apartment in the tree, I like that he calls it an apartment. When I came down from my apartment in the tree, I looked about me again, and the first thing I found was the boat, which lay as the wind and the sea had tossed her upon the land, about 2 miles on my right hand. So remember, this is the lifeboat that they got into, that they were capsized out of. I walked as far as I could upon the shore to have got to her, but found a neck or inlet of water between me and the boat, which was about half a mile broad. So I came back for the present, being more intent upon getting at the ship, where I hoped to find something for my present subsistence. A little after noon, I found the sea very calm, and the tide ebbed so far out that I could come within a quarter of a mile of the ship, and here I found a fresh renewing of my grief, for I saw evidently that if we had kept on board, we had been all safe. That is to say, we had all got safe on shore, and I had not been so miserable as to be left entirely destitute of all comfort and company. So Robinson has realized that if, instead of rushing into the lifeboat because they're scared that this ship is going to, break in two or become dashed by the heavy winds and the rain, that if they'd stayed on board, they would have all been saved, and they would have all probably made it safely to shore. But as it is, Robinson is the only one who has survived. This forced tears from my eyes again, but as there was little relief in that, I resolved, if possible, to get to the ship. So I pulled off my clothes, for the weather was hot to extremity, and took the water. I was able to make 11 trips to the boat and built rafts to bring the goods I wanted back to the shore. Now, okay, so this is interesting. This is an example of how this has been abridged. In the original book, we get to see a slow breakdown of all the events that transpired as he goes to the ship, as he finds the goods that are on there, as he builds the rafts and brings them back, and then he goes to the ship again and he builds another raft and he brings more goods back. And that is a much slower process in the original text, and here they have greatly abbreviated that to for the most part just saying, I was able to make 11 trips to the boat and built rafts to bring the goods I wanted back to the shore. In short, I took from the boat everything that could be useful to me in my present condition: wood, cables, string, the few tools I could find, a grindstone, nails, guns and powder and shot, swords, food and drink, clothes, a hammock, some bedding, and some canvas, with which I made myself a tent. Apart from these, I got several things of less value, but not less useful to me, in particular pens, ink and paper, compasses, and 3 Bibles. But preparing the 12th time to go on board, I found the wind begin to rise. However, at a low water I went on board, and though I thought I had rummaged the cabin so effectually that nothing more could be found, yet I discovered a locker with drawers in it, in one of which I found 2 or 3 razors and 1 pair of large scissors, with some 10 or a dozen of good knives and forks. In another I found some 36 pounds value in money, some European coin, some Brazil, some pieces of 8, some gold, some silver. I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. What art thou good for? Said I aloud. Thou art not worth to me. No. Oh, I need to read that again. Okay. I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. What art thou good for? Said I aloud. Thou art not worth to me. No, not the taking off of the ground. One of those knives is worth all this heap. I have no manner of use for thee. Remain where thou art and go to the bottom as a creature whose life is not worth saving. However, upon second thoughts, I took it away. And wrapping all this in a piece of canvas, I began to think of making another raft. But while I was preparing this, I found the sky overcast, and the wind began to rise, and in a quarter of an hour it blew a fresh gale from the shore. It presently occurred to me that it was in vain to pretend to make a raft with the wind offshore, and that it was my business to be gone before the tide of flood began, otherwise I might not be able to reach the shore at all. Accordingly, I let myself down into the water and swam across the channel which lay between the ship and the sands, and even that with difficulty enough, partly with the weight of the things I had about me, partly the roughness of the water. For the wind rose very hastily, and before it was quite high water, it blew a storm. But I got home to my little tent, where I lay with all my wealth about me very secure. It blew very hard all that night, and in the morning, when I looked out, behold, no more ship was to be seen. I was a little surprised, but recovered myself with this satisfactory reflection that I had lost no time. nor abated no diligence to get everything out of her that could be useful to me, and that indeed there was little left in her that I was able to bring away if I had more time. I now gave over any more thoughts of the ship, or of anything out of her, except what might drive on shore from her wreck, as indeed divers pieces of her afterwards did, but those things were of small use to me. My thoughts were now wholly employed about securing myself against either savages, if any should appear, or wild beasts, if any were in the island. And I had many thoughts of the method how to do this, and what kind of dwelling to make, whether I should make me a cave in the earth or a tent upon the earth, and in short I resolved upon both, the manner and description of which it may not be improper to give an account of. I soon found the place I was in was not for my settlement, particularly because it was upon a low marshy ground near the sea, and I believed would not be wholesome, and more particularly because there was no fresh water near it, so I resolved to find a more healthy and more convenient spot of ground. I consulted several things in my situation, which I found would be proper for me. First, health and fresh water I just now mentioned. Secondly, shelter from the heat of the sun. Thirdly, security from ravenous creatures, whether men or beasts. Fourthly, a view to the sea, that if God sent any ship in sight, I might not lose any advantage for my deliverance, of which I was not willing to banish all my expectation yet. In search of a place proper for this, I found a little plain on the side of a rising hill, whose front towards this little plain was steep as a house side, so that nothing could come down upon me from the top, or the side of this rock. On the side of this rock there was a hollow place worn a little way in, like the entrance or door of a cave, but there was not really any cave or way into the rock at all. On the flat of the green, just before this hollow place, I resolved to pitch my tent. This plain was not above 100 yards broad, and about twice as long, and lay like a green before my door, and at the end of it descended irregularly every way down into the low grounds by the seaside. It was on the northwest side of the hill, so that I was sheltered from the heat every day till it came to a west and by south sun, or thereabouts, which in those countries is near the setting. Before I set up my tent, I drew a half circle before the hollow place, which took in about 10 yards in its semi-diameter from the rock, and 20 yards in its diameter from its beginning and ending. In this half circle I pitched 2 rows of strong stakes, driving them into the ground till they stood very firm, the biggest end being out of the ground about 5 foot and a half, and sharpened on the top. The two rows did not stand above 6 inches from one another, so he's building a fence around his new home. Then I took the pieces of cable which I had cut into the ship and laid them in rows one upon another within the circle, between these 2 rows of stakes, up to the top, placing other stakes in the inside, leaning against them about 2 foot and a half high, like a spur to a post. And this fence was so strong that neither man or beast could get into it or over it. This cost me a great deal of time and labor, especially to cut the stakes in the woods, bring them to the place, and drive them into the earth. The entrance into this place I made to be not by a door, but by a short ladder to go over the top, which ladder, when I was in, I lifted over after me, and so I was completely fenced in and fortified, as I thought, from all the world, and consequently slept secure in the night, which otherwise I could not have done, though, as it appeared afterwards, there was no need for all this caution from the enemies that I apprehended danger from. Into this fence or fortress, with infinite labor, I carried all my riches, all my provisions, ammunition, and stores, of which you have the account above. And I made me a large tent, which preserved me from the rains that in one part of the year are very violent there. I made double, one smaller tent within and one larger tent above it, and covered the uppermost with a large tarpaulin, tarpaulin which I had saved among the sails. And now I lay no more for a while in the bed which I had brought on shore, but in a hammock, which was indeed a very good one and belonged to the mate of the ship. Into this tent I brought all my provisions and everything that would spoil by the wet, and having thus enclosed all my goods, I made up the entrance, which till now I had left open, and so passed and repassed, as I said, by a short ladder. When I had done this, I began to work my way into the rock, and bringing all the earth and stones that I dug down out through my tent, I laid them up within my fence in the nature of a terrace, that so it raised the ground within about 1.5 feet, and thus I made me a cave just behind my tent, which served me like a cellar to my house. It cost me much labor and many days before all these things were brought to perfection. I went out at least once every day with my gun, as well as to divert myself as to see if I could kill anything fit for food, and as near as I could to acquaint myself with what the island produced. The first time I went out, I presently discovered that there were goats in the islands, which was a great satisfaction to me. I soon found that if they saw me in the valleys, though they were upon the rocks, they would run away as in a terrible fright. But if they were feeding in the valleys and I was upon the rocks, they took no notice of me. Their sight was so directed downward that they did not readily see objects that were above them. So afterward, I took this method. I always climbed the rocks first to get above them, and then had frequently a fair mark. So he's looking down on them. I had a dismal prospect of my condition, for as I was not cast away upon that island without being driven by a violent storm quite out of the course of our intended voyage, and some hundreds of leagues out of the ordinary course of the trade of mankind, I had great reason to consider it as a determination of heaven that in this desolate place and in this desolate manner I should end my life. So he's not in any of the routes that is usually used by ships. So he doesn't really expect a ship to ever come past him. It was, by my account, the 30th of September when, in the manner as above said, I first set foot upon this horrid island. After I had been there about 10 or 12 days, it came into my thoughts that I should lose my reckoning of time, and should even forget the Sabbath days from the working days. But to prevent this, I cut with my knife upon a large post in capital letters, and making it into a great cross, I set it up on the shore where I first landed. I came on shore here on the 30th of September, 1659. Upon the sides of the square post I cut every day a notch with my knife, and every 7th notch was as long again as the rest, and every first day of the month as long again as that long one, and thus I kept my calendar. Notwithstanding all that I had amassed together, I lacked many tools for life on land. This want of tools made every work I did go on heavily, and it was near a whole year before I had entirely finished my little pale or surrounded habitation. So it takes him a long time basically to build this fortification and cave and tent dwelling that he creates for himself. Nearly a whole year. The stakes, which were as heavy as I could well lift, were a long time in cutting and preparing in the woods, and more by far in bringing home, so that I spent sometimes 2 days in cutting and bringing home one of those posts, and a 3rd day in driving it into the ground, for which purpose I got a heavy piece of wood at first, but at last bethought myself of an iron crowbar I had salvaged from the boat, which, however, though I found it, yet it made driving those posts very laborious and tedious work. But what need had I to be concerned at the tediousness of anything I had to do, seeing I had time enough to do it in? Nor had I any other employment if that had been over, at least that I could foresee, except the ranging the island to seek for food, which I did more or less every day. I now began to consider seriously my condition and the circumstance I was reduced to, and I drew up the state of my affairs in writing, not so much to leave them to any that were to come after me, for for I was like to have but few heirs, as to deliver my thoughts from daily poring upon them and afflicting my mind. And as my reason began now to master my despondency, I began to comfort myself as well as I could, and to set the good against the evil, that I might have something to distinguish my case from worse. And I stated it very impartially, like debtor and creditor, and comforts I enjoyed against the miseries I suffered, thus. There we go. So, he has good, there. He has good on one side and evil on the other side, and he's created kind of a ledger of sorts for himself. Evil. I am cast upon a horrible desolate island, void of all hope of recovery. Good. But I am alive, and not drowned as all my ship's company was. Evil. I am singled out and separated, as it were, from all the world to be miserable. Good. But I am singled out, too, from all the ship's crew to be spared from death, and he that miraculously saved me from death can deliver me from this condition, and that he is God. Evil. I am divided from mankind, a solitaire, one banished from human society. I have not clothes to cover me. Good. But I am not starved and perishing on a barren place, affording no sustenance. But I am in a hot climate, where if I had no clothes, I could hardly wear them. I am without any defense or means to resist any violence of man or beast. But I am cast on an island where I see no wild beasts to hurt me, as I saw on the coast of Africa. And what if I had been shipwrecked there? So unlike his previous disastrous expedition, here at least there are no lions or people out to get him. Evil. I have no soul to speak to or relieve me. Good. But God wonderfully sent the ship in near enough to the shore that I have got out so many necessary things as will either supply my wants or enable me to supply myself even as long as I live. Yes, Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Sometimes even when we run away from him. Yes. Having now brought my mind a little to relish my condition, and given over looking out to see if I could spy a ship, I say, giving over these things, that means giving up. I began to apply myself to accommodate my way of living, and to make things as easy to me as I could. I have already described my habitation, which was a tent under the side of a rock, surrounded by a strong pale of posts and cables. But I might now rather call it a wall, for I raised a kind of wall up against it of turfs, about 2 feet thick on the outside, and after some time, I think it was a year and a half, I raised rafters from it, leaning to the rock, and thatched or covered it with branches and such things as I could get to keep out the rain, which I found at some times of the year very violent. Which, I mean, as you remember, one of the reasons he's here in the first place was because of a horrible storm, which included intense rain, I'm assuming. I have already observed how I brought all my goods into this pail and into the cave which I had made behind me. But I must observe, too, that at first this was a confused heap of goods, which as they lay in no order, so they took up all my place. And I had no room to turn myself, so I set myself to enlarge my cave and works farther into the earth. For it was a loose, sandy rock, which yielded easily to the labor I bestowed on it. And so, when I found I was pretty safe as to beasts of prey, I worked sideways to the right hand into the rock, and then turning it to the right again, worked quite out, and made me a door to come out on the outside of my fortification. This gave me not only egress and regress, as it were a back way into my cave and to my storehouse, but it gave me room to stow my goods. And now I began to apply myself to make such necessary things as I found I most wanted, as particularly a chair and a table, for without these I was not able to enjoy the few comforts I had in the world. I could not write or eat or do several things with so much pleasure without a table. So I went to work. I had never handled a tool in my life, and yet in time, by labor, application, and contrivance, I found at last that I wanted nothing but I could have made it, especially if I had had tools. However, I made abundance of things, even without tools, and some with no more tools than an adze and a hatchet, which perhaps were never made that way before, and that with infinite labor. And you see this often in stories of people who have been stuck in some kind of very unfortunate circumstance. Suddenly they are able to do things that they never thought they would be able to do in the past, or they're able to learn and figure things out that they have never learned or figured out in the past. And I believe that's happened in the world in 2020 with COVID-19, where a lot of people suddenly picked up new skills that they never previously had due to time or due to the constraints that have been put on them given the situation of lockdown or quarantine or whatever it happens to be where they are. Okay, so for example, if I wanted a board, I had no other way but to cut down a tree, set it on an edge before me, and hew it flat on either side with my axe, till I had brought it to be thin as a plank, and then dub it smooth with my adze. It is true, by this method I could make but one board out of a whole tree, but this I had no remedy for but patience, any more than I had for the prodigious deal of time and labor which it took me up to make a plank or board. But my time or labor was little worth, and so it was as well employed one way as another. However, I made me a table and a chair, as I observed above, in the first place, and this I did out of short pieces of boards that I brought on my raft from the ship. But when I had brought out some boards as above, I made large shelves of the breadth of a foot and a half one over another, all along one side of my cave, to lay all my tools, nails, and ironwork, and in a word, to separate everything at large in their places, so that I could come easily at them. I knocked pieces into the wall of the rock to hang my guns and all things that would hang up. And now it was when I began to keep a journal of every day's employment. For indeed at first I was in too much hurry, and not only hurry as to labor, but in too much discomposure of mind, and my journal would have been full of many dull things. For example, I might have said thus: September the 30th. After I got to shore and had escaped drowning, instead of being thankful to God for my deliverance, having first vomited with the great quantity of salt water which I had got into my stomach, and recovering myself a little, I ran about the shore, wringing my hands and beating my head and face, exclaiming at my misery and crying out, I was undone, undone, till tired and faint I was forced to lie down on the ground to repose, but dared not sleep for fear of being devoured. Well, I personally don't find that particularly dull, but hey ho, that's Robinson says that would have been a dull entry in his journal if he had started writing his journal earlier when he was very distraught at his circumstances. Some days after this, and after I had been on board the ship and got all that I could out of her, yet I could not forbear getting up to the top of a little mountain and looking out to sea in hopes of seeing a ship. Then fancy at a vast distance I spied a sail, please myself with the hopes of it, and then after looking steadily till I was almost blind, lose it quite, and sit down and weep like a child, and thus increase my misery by my folly. But having got over these things in some measure, and having settled my household stuff and habitation, made me a table and a chair, and all as handsome about me as I could. I began to keep my journal, of which I shall here give you a copy, though in it you will be told of all these particulars over again. As long as it lasted, for having no more ink, I was forced to leave off. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 4. In chapter 5, we will see the first of his journal entries, and that will in some ways take us back in time a little bit. But yes, we will get into that in chapter 5. Now I am going to read to you a short extract from a more original version of the text, because we have been reading the abridged text. I'm going to read you a passage that is the original version of a passage from pages 42 and 43. So if you have your copy of the book there, 42, the bottom of page 42 and the top of page 43. This is mirror opposite for me, but anyways, hopefully you can find that. Again, chapter 4, pages 42 to 43. We're going to look at the paragraph at the bottom of page 42 that starts off with, I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. What art thou good for, said I aloud. Thou art not worth to me, no, not the taking off of the ground of one of those knives is worth all this heap. Okay, and so I have the original version here. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge really appreciated this passage from the text. He compared it to Shakespeare, said it was worthy of Shakespeare. In other words, he found this a particularly poetic and well-written passage. I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. O drug, said I aloud, what art thou good for? Thou art not worth to me, no, not the taking off of the ground. One of those knives is worth all this heap. I have no manner of use for thee. E'en remain where thou art, and go to the bottom, as a creature whose life is not worth saving. However, upon second thoughts, I took it away, and wrapping all this in a piece of canvas, I began to think of making another raft. But while I was preparing this, I found the sky overcast, and the wind began to rise, and in a quarter of an hour it blew a fresh gale from the shore. It presently occurred to me that it was in vain to pretend to make a raft with the wind offshore, and that it was my business to be gone before the tide of flood began. Otherwise, I might not be able to reach the shore at all. Accordingly, I let myself down into the water and swam across the channel, which lay between the ship and the sands, and even that with difficulty enough, partly with the weight of the things I had about me, and partly the roughness of the water, for the wind rose very hastily, and before it was quite high water, it blew a storm. So you can see there's not that many differences. There's a few, particularly at the beginning, where he says, I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. Oh, drug! Which our version does not have. So you can think about why he may have called money a drug. And another difference, which you can't tell from my reading out loud to you, but that there were a lot more capital letters in the original text than in the version that we are reading today. Because at that time, it was more common to capitalize the first letter of pretty much any noun that you used in your writing. So yes, whereas today we capitalize mainly the proper nouns and the noun and the first letter of a sentence. Back then, capital letters all over the place. So I think nowadays, in many ways, it is easier to read a lot of small text than a lot of text with capital letters. Additionally, some of the punctuation is a little bit different. Okay, so after this, we have chapter 5, the beginning of Robinson Crusoe's personal journal.